Welcome back to Razmafsar TV. I'm very happy to have Dr. Emmons, Dr. Jim Emmons here on our channel. Hi, Jim. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me back.
Thank you very much, Jim. Today, we are going to talk about a very, very important topic. And I'm really happy that you have prepared a PowerPoint presentation and slides so we can go through and see how to work with historical sources. And it is extremely important. So you as an academic, we as academics can share how to work with sources with members of our community. So Jim, could you please share the slides so we can go through them?
Yeah, give me just 1 second. I've got to make all this work here. Okay. Is that showing up all right?
Yes.
Okay. So I should say, this is a very introductory look at this, and there are other people who have presented things. I think maybe a year or two ago, Rebecca Glass did a small YouTube piece on this. I don't think we can go over it enough. And so, if people enjoy this and it's useful to them, we can go into more detail. But what I really wanted to do is kind of provide an overview of what we do.
Yes.
As far as the things that are in place that allow us to do it. And then a little bit of sort of an introduction to, okay, I have this source. How do I teach it? How do I use it? So this looks very academic and fancy, but it's a pretty bare bones look. So the first thing I think we should talk about is what is a source in terms of historical fencing. And give me a minute. There we go. Okay. We can define sources many different ways. In history, for example, we normally talk about the written word, and that only goes back about 5,000 years. That could be what we sometimes call a primary source, which is a piece written by people at the time. It could be a secondary source, which is a source that talks about that time or analyzes that time. So that could include everything from a history written in the past to histories we write now. Those get kind of thorny, but just think written source. In historical fencing, we also use other types of evidence. We have artifacts, so extant weapons, for example. We have artwork, which can be very helpful. It can be tricky to use, but it can also be very helpful. We also have, not to be grim, but we have, in a few rare cases, so far rare, mass graves from battle sites, things like that, that give us some idea of the effect of these weapons. Even if we can't tell necessarily the difference between an axe and a sword, damage to bones and things that have survived can be very illuminating. So that's more of an archaeological or forensic anthropology thing. And I think most people probably don't look at that, but it does inform our picture of things.
Yes.
As far as sources for historical fencing, the earliest one, I believe, for the West, and that's an important caveat, is the 14th century 133, or the Walpurgis manuscript. And it's a picture of Walpurgis here. It's a sword and buckler document. There's some belief that it might be sort of lesson plans. It isn't completely, doesn't have an introduction and a conclusion in the same way that a lot of works do. But as you can see from the image here, you get some idea of how people may have been holding things. And this is stylized. So we'll get to art in a second, but this person is supposed to be walking. Some people believe it or not, have taken that to mean that you should tiptoe. You're not supposed to tiptoe. It's just an artist trying to depict movement. Later, sort of high Middle Ages on, we get more documents. There's, for the Liechtenauer tradition, there's Delle and other, the Dobringer, those documents. Fiore de Liberi is another good one with his Fiore de Battaglia. And these are difficult because of a number of reasons. We have works that talk about fighting, like books, right? But we also have things that refer to fighting, so chronicles or histories.
Yes.
Starting in the 15th century, we have the printing press. And with the printing press, as it starts to sort of gather speed, we get a lot more documents. And it's possible to make more copies. They're not written by hand. You can make many. So, for rapier texts, we tend to have a lot more of those. Small sword, we have a lot. I think one website lists at least 120 different documents for small sword, and that's not including copies. By the 18th to the 20th century, we have who knows how many different military tracts or civilian tracts written for fencing.
Yes.
And again, we have art and weapons and armor, things like that inform our picture.
Yes.
So this is just sort of a broad look. Here you have, I think this is the Abingdon hilt from England. It's a migration period, early Middle Ages sword hilt. That's an artifact. We have a couple different pictures from various manuscripts. There's, I believe, there's Marcelli there in the corner with rapier and dagger.
Yep.
Angelo up top. That might be the Gladiatoria, but I can't remember now what that one with the poleaxes is, but medieval. I've also included one of the skulls, I believe, from, it might have been Turin, that was clearly hit pretty hard with something sharp, slicing off that corner of their left skull. Then there's a picture of different sources. So we have Froissart, who recorded a lot of important information about the 100 Years' War. Yep. He was there. We have, witnesses that were there. We have a piece in French, and we also have my friend Chris Holzman's translation of Del Frate's 1876 military tract for cavalry on sabre, mostly sabre.
Yeah.
These are all different sources that we use,
Yes.
and we may use them differently. So that's sort of an overview of the types of things we look at. All of them have challenges. So the earlier we go, and the less familiar alphabets are, we have an orthographical problem. Just reading the alphabet, that can be difficult, especially with medieval manuscripts.
Alphabet and also semantic shift. Am I correct?
Yes, huge. In fact, semantic shift is maybe, I think, one of the things that I've encountered most with translations and historical fencing is that, using a modern dictionary for French, for example, may not work perfectly well for the text you're reading. As a classic example, I believe it's in de Saint-Martin's 1804, 1805 work on sabre and small sword, he uses the word espadon for sabre. Well, the modern definition of that is swordfish. Pretty sure he's not talking about swordfish in that text. And yet there is at least one translation out there that just translated it straight as that. So hold your swordfish thus, that's a pretty important semantic shift. So how do you figure that out? Well, by context, a fencing master is probably not talking about fish, right? Second, you need to find sort of the history of that word. And there are places to go. There's a really good, for French anyway, there's a really good website, I have to look it up, that's basically kind of like the Oxford English Dictionary, but for French words. And so you get the history of the usage of that word. And you see that semantic shift over time. And that's absolutely vital because words change.
Yes. Jim, I don't want to hijack your topic.
No, please.
For example, as you know, I had translated many archery manuals, also firearms. Just one thing, there is an end of 18th century, 19th century historical manuals on firearms, and it is called, in Persian I use it, feshang. Feshang back then was used to refer to rockets, like congreve rockets. Remember? The Indians used against the English. But in today's Persian, feshang means bullet. So, you see, and there was a translator who had translated it, and everybody said bullets. But then he describes clearly you're shooting a rocket against the enemy lines, right? And he said bullet, but you don't hold it like that. And then everything was about a rocket. And then I asked myself, you're a translator, I don't want to criticize, right? The gentleman, but why don't you, because he didn't have any idea about military and weapons, right? Why
Right.
don't you come to this idea that a bullet is not has an arc, right? And it went on and on. And it is some, for example, Fishang again. Back then was rocket. In today's Persian means bullet.
Right. It's true. And, you know, in fairness to that translator, translation is extremely hard, you know, and I think it's with all the tools people have today, it's sort of easy to take for granted that, oh, well, you know, I'll just put it into this AI thing and have it figured out. It's not that simple. And in your example, this is perfect. Historical knowledge, contextual knowledge is everything.
Yeah.
You know, when I was first learning Latin, for example, we'd have words that could mean a couple different things depending on the usage. And I asked the professor, you know, how do I know which one? He said, context. Context will tell you. And then, of course, as a new student, you know, I didn't have that context yet, but over time I developed it, and I could think, okay, well, it could mean this, it could mean that. What is most likely given, you know, the nature of this document and what it's about? And in that case, you know, the poor translator, maybe, you know, I don't know who they are, of course, but when I get stuck, I ask somebody wiser than me. Happy for me, and this is one of the great things about academia, is that I know a lot of very smart people, and many of whom, most of whom, are far better at these languages than I am. And so I ask for help, and it's useful. I've got a couple examples, you know, going forward of in real time of times I've said, okay, I don't know what this is, or I'll have somebody check it, because you have to, because those are easy mistakes to make.
Yes.
You know, that's a great example. I can't say the word, but bullet, rocket. I mean, those are very different things. You
Yes.
know.
Yes.
But yeah, so language, especially semantic shift, knowledge of the language is important too. So if you learn Italian today, that's not going to be the same as Italian dialects in the 15th century.
Yes.
They're different.
Absolutely.
You know, and so some knowledge of that is important, because you may be able to read a menu super well, but that ability is not going to help you, you know, looking at Vadi. That might be a lot harder.
That's right.
You know, the other issue to think about, and we'll get to images in a second, is that a lot of times we don't have the full document. Maybe it's been damaged. Maybe it's incomplete. You know, sometimes we only get fragments of things. The 133 document, for example, maybe there was more, maybe there wasn't. We don't know.
Yes.
And that's an important thing to consider. Going back to what you said about the meaning of bullet versus rocket, that historical context, you have to have some knowledge of that. And there are places to go, happily. You know, in the age of the internet, there's a lot of bad information out there, but there's a lot of good information too. And so reading up on the period that you're studying can really be helpful. There's also a cultural context, and by that I mean, it's one thing to sort of read, let's say a dance manual from the 18th century, but it's another thing to understand the place of dance in the 18th century. And so that's the distinction I'd make, to say, between historical context, dance was important, and then cultural context, here's why it was important. And that's just a distinction I tend to make, because, you know, you could read Finnegan's Wake. You could read it out loud. That doesn't mean you understand it, right? I mean, there's work involved. The literary context is important. You know, I think this will probably be true for your sources too. If you're looking at a military source, a lot of times those tend to be a lot more to the point. You know, I read mostly Italian and French military sources, and there's not a lot of introduction. There's not a lot of flowery language. They want that information to be conveyed clearly.
Yeah.
Where it's an individual author that's maybe seeking patronage, that may have a lot of very flowery, oh, Duke so-and-so, you're the best, and just go on and on and on. That is a literary convention. And so there are a lot of things you have to kind of look for with that and understand why that's important. Purpose. Again, those military manuals are meant, let's say like a sabre manual. It's meant normally to help a regimental sword instructor know the bare minimum of what they need to teach. That's going to be different than a master who wants to get a job with an important nobleman and he's seeking patronage, right? He's going to maybe spend a little extra money for really good images, maybe brag a little bit, humbly or not, and that changes. The other thing is sometimes, and this is often the case, we don't know how important a source was at the time. One of the sources I've been working with recently is by a Charles Bayonet, who was a French master in the 17th century. And we know he approached the lords of Brittany in France. That's who it's dedicated to. But as far as we can tell, it wasn't well known at the time. In later years, a number of masters would look back and mention him. So delle mentions him, for example, in 1670, I think it is. And later masters will talk about this being an important work. But in the time that it was written, we don't know if anyone read it. So that legacy can kind of mask how important a source is. With 133, for example, it's important because it's early. But there may have been way better instruction manuals out there that just were lost. And we can't know. Those are all things we have to consider when we look at these things. When we look at Fiore, for example, we have 4 major manuscripts for him, and that's huge for the Middle Ages, right? But is he representative? I don't know. You can compare some of this stuff with German material at the same time, 1390 to 1410. You can do that. Does that say much for 100 years before? No. We can infer some things and guess some things, but we can't say for certain.
Yes.
Yeah. As an example of some of those difficulties, so these are 3 different images of the segno in Fiore's works. And if you look at the more colorful one, this is from the Paris or the Florius. If you look closely, you can see some of those, especially the rubric and the letters and words in red are obscured. Now, if you only had this document and you didn't have the other 3, it might be very difficult to figure out what those words are. Yeah. At the top, for example, maybe you can read it under a close, magnification, but we're lucky that the people who have been working on the Paris and translated it recently have these other documents to compare it against, right? So we know these are from the same school, and you can look at the way that those labels are situated and what they are in the other manuscripts, and you can supply those to the places where it's missing. This is lucky. A lot of times this doesn't happen. We'll get a page that's missing words. There are times when you can, by context, fill that in, and there are times when it's dangerous to do so. Going back a bit, the Athenian tribute lists from their empire in the 5th century BCE, there are scholars who've filled in these very fragmentary, stone inscriptions. How accurate that is, I think, is a matter of debate. And yet there are people who take that, okay, well, here's the transliteration, and they just run with it. Some footnotes saying, well, some of this is guesswork, should be present. And we need to do the same. When we're using a source, there are things that we can say, like in this case, if you look at the segno, Fiore clearly saw these 4 virtues as important, and he plays those out. Beyond that, we can talk a little bit about what may have influenced him in terms of symbolism and things like that. And we have some evidence for that, but we can only go so far.
What do these animals mean? Just a very short explanation.
Yeah, well, my favorite is the one at the bottom, is the elephant, and it means strength. So I have some of my friends who teach Fiore, for example, like Alex Spryer and Mike Sherba, who, well, they're not teaching it much now, but they have in the past. They'll talk about, make sure you've got your elephant. That means you're in a stable, secure position. There's bravery. I can't read that quite. I don't have my glasses on, but there are different virtues that are supposed to be important in fighting. Bravery, strength, wisdom in a way, like knowing what to look for, paying attention. Prudencia, I think, is one of them. So They also have these symbols of those things. So these animals in the Middle Ages were meant to represent those things. The elephants are big; they have huge feet that touch the ground. They look secure. The lynx is fast. It's agile. So these are very good visual ways to represent this, and they're great mnemonic devices for students, even now. If Alex says, "Hey, remember your elephant," immediately you think, okay, and you take that image, you connect it to an idea. It's the same thing here. You'll also notice it's obvious in all of these that there are swords sort of emanating from the figure, and these show the major lines of attack for his system. Incidentally, they're pretty common. I've seen very similar things. There's one Korean sword system in Gumdo that uses, I believe it's the Chinese character for light. And it uses that character because that's basically the strokes that you make with the sword. It's very similar to this, which is interesting. Now, that's an interesting parallel, but I would never say one influenced the other. They're separated by time, a lot of other things, but it's an interesting similarity. As another example, and this is one I wanted to point out because this is one that affected me. I was working on a paper and I needed to look at this one Danish source. And this one is from Jonas von Winsleben. And as I was reading the English, so I had Ronnie von Noort's translation, which is very good. And I thought, well, I want to look at the Danish. I want to see what it is. I don't know Danish. I know a little bit of German. I can read it a little bit. But it's important looking at a translation to look at the original language too. So I wanted to see it, and so I looked at the manuscript. And if you look at that first word, F-T, that second character looks a lot like a long S, which I'm used to seeing in other sources. So when I first transcribed this for myself, I had S-30. Well, I sent this to Renier, and I said, "Hey, could you check my math?" And he's like, "Ooh, red pen. And he fixed all the places I had messed it up. And so, in the footnote in the paper, I thank him for his help because one should do that. But that's an easy mistake to make. And I've looked at this kind of script a lot, but I still made a goof. It happens, right? And so in transcribing even something we're more familiar with, we can mess up. I'm not even sure there is a word in Danish that would be, estety, but if I was trying to find one and couldn't, that could potentially affect how I myself would have translated that, where I'm more able to do so. It's a tough job, translation. It is. Sort of looking back at Fiore. So here's another example of transliteration. You've got the original text on one side, and you have one person's attempt to put that into modern script. If you know Italian, you'll recognize that this is Italianish, but there are differences too. There's some words in here that are not spelled the same way today. And again, if you're not super familiar with the period, that can be a problem. Never mind semantic shift. You may just spell it wrong or think it's a different word. And what I like about this is that, you have an image and you have the master describing, what that is. And it makes for an interesting interplay between text, image, and what we make of it. And this is one of the places I think we tend to get into trouble, right? We have a description of something, and in this case, this is a pretty short description of what we're looking at. So he says, here begins the giacolargo, or wide plays of the sword in two hands. Master is crossed at the point of the sword, this player says, when I'm crossed at the points, I quickly switch my sword to the other side and strike him from that side with a downward blow to his head or arms. Alternatively, I can place a thrust into his face, as the next picture will show. Well, these are very static images. Do we take them one for one? I think that's dangerous to do. In most cases, they're not photographic. Never mind the issues with photographs and what you can do with those. But here you have a sense, okay, swords are crossed, more or less closer to the last third, and he tells you two options. Yeah. What's interesting, this is something we'll return to, this exact type of play exists throughout his fencing history. So for the last 600 years, there's a similar thing you can do in foil or sabre. So That is to say, if the blades are engaged, if there's pressure, I disengage and cut over. If there's no pressure, I can take opposition and thrust. Same idea. You're just doing it with this weapon. That is my interpretation of how that would be done. There are other people who might see that differently. And we tend to get hung up on little details. Somebody will try to measure how far apart their feet are or the exact level of their arms. He doesn't say. And so the best we can do is say, well, this seems to be what he's talking about. And until a better interpretation comes out, we're going to run with it.
Yeah.
But it's difficult. And I think one of the things I've noticed with historical fencing is that a lot of people work very closely from images, but sometimes those images are more stylized or fancy. And if you've done any fighting at all, it's kind of like kata in Eastern martial arts. If you've done that competitively, they're grading you on exact motions.
Yes.
You don't necessarily fight like that when you're actually fighting.
No.
That's something to think about. So interpretation, sort of the basics, there's the transcription of the language, depending on your period of study. And that means taking like crazy old alphabet and turning it into yours. There's translation of the text, so from one language to another, and of the images, right? The important thing to remember, at least as I look at it, is that all interpretations with historical fencing are tentative.
Yes.
They have to be. Now, there are some exceptions, I think, for maybe more recent, like, say, early 20th century military texts. You could argue that they're less tentative in the sense that, at least until very recently, there were people trained within those systems that could speak to them. That's something we can't do 100 or 500 years ago.
Yes.
So I think it's difficult to accept that we might have a really, really good interpretation, but we don't know for sure. And we have to be open to the fact that we could be wrong.
Yes.
So why are they tentative? A couple reasons. One, we don't have all the facts. If you look at a lot of sword manuals, I'll pick on Fiore again. He assumes a body of knowledge that you have coming to his book.
Yes.
He doesn't have day one for a 7-year-old who's starting out on their training or a squire at 17. He assumes you know all that. So you get his take on things that you pretty much already know, but they're his sort of tweak on them. Yes. We very rarely have full explanations. My favorite for this is when, let's say, a later period text, they're talking about a parry, and they just say, we'll make an inside parry and then cut back. Well, what kind of cut? Where do you want it to go?
Yeah.
There are certain things we can sort of guess, but sometimes they don't tell us. My favorite is take a step. What kind of step? Is it a passing step? Is it an accrescimento? Like, is it a step? It may assume that you know. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And
Jim,
yeah.
I have translated like 9 Persian archery manuals, and then with B Tschen, archery expert from Australia, then we interpreted them and also put them into practice. But one thing, Beat and I were always laughing about it. In all manuscripts written by different people, some of them we don't know the author, is unknown. They explain in detail archery, right? But then after 1 or 2 paragraphs, they write, and everyone knows the rest, or God knows all. So they stop and they go to the next one and they say, oh God, hell, what does it mean God knows all? Everyone knows it. You see, they assume that they are so basic, so you know the rest. Either God knows all or everyone knows that. In all manuscript, I translated.
Yeah, I see the same thing. And it's kind of charming in a way. I'm trying to remember. There's a line from Sir William Hope's one of his books, and it's kind of one of these. Well, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
No, I don't know what you mean. Please spell it out. But it's charming because it's such a human thing to do.
Yeah.
And one of the things when I was teaching history formally that I sort of my platform for history, as it were, is I always told students, look, people are people and have been for a very long time. And so while things may change and technology may change, some of our basic humanity hasn't. And so, you know, to write in a text, well, my hand's getting tired. You know what I mean. You know the rest.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's just something we do. But for people now, right, it's like, well, what is the rest? Would somebody please write what the rest is for us so we could, you know, figure that out? The other thing that's tough is our context is different. You know, when you're looking at the archery manuals, for example, you have a modern archery expert and you shoot too. So you guys have information you bring to that, but you've learned it at a different time in a different context, right? And so I think it's the same for me. You know, the training that I had in various martial arts is different than the way those started. There may be a lineage there. There may be a lot of similarity, but there have been changes too.
You know, Jim, one of the, I just, excuse me, again, I don't want to hijack that, but a big difference in archery manuals we discuss about, I'm talking about Persian. Persian bows are heavy. We are talking about 120, 140, 150 poundage.
Wow.
Right? Thumb draw.
Okay.
Now, you look at all these modern archers, you see two different things. 30 poundage, 35, max 40. Right? So then, excuse me that I say that, and I also said it to many colleagues, you know that Jim I always say. I also, to Devin, you know, Berman, you know, our colleague from Canada, he always loves that because he always said the first technique is physical fitness, because we need to be in a physical shape to understand it, you know, because then I go and say, okay, I'm shooting it, you know, and they do it very fast, modern archers, because they are using 30 poundage bow. You cannot do the same move with 120, 140. And it doesn't matter how strong you are. You see? So you see these using toys to understand, excuse me, what real thing was is a common, let's say, mad practice in archery.
Yeah. You know, we see the same thing in historical fencing too.
Yes.
And for me, it's difficult because I think I can see the value in different ways of doing this. So, for example, you know, just recently there was a hullabaloo about a new light fader that came out for longsword. A lot of them in the past have been either too rigid or too heavy, and of course, historically speaking, they vary a little bit. But people get very, very devoted to a particular thing that they've been exposed to or they're used to. And I think, you know, it's important to step back and be like, well, first of all, we're using different technology to make most of these things. They varied historically because they weren't mass produced. And a lot comes down to being aware of those changes. So, for example, when I teach children, I don't use a period weight saber. Maybe they can handle it, maybe they can't, but they're going to tire out way faster.
Yes.
And so they use a lighter one. But I have to be aware that that changes things, right? Yes. And if they stick with me and they grow and they move into something a little bit more historically weighted, there's an adjustment period where they know what to do, but their muscles aren't ready. Yeah, and so there's some conditioning that comes with that. And you're right. You know, I think the nature of what we do, especially in like contact sports or contact pursuits, there are things we can't do. One of my favorite to point out is that if people really tried to use Fiore's system the way that he designed it, we'd be breaking and murdering people all the time.
Yes.
We can't do that. We shouldn't do that, right? It's supposed to be fun. Having your elbow broken is not fun.
Of course.
That's a context that's different. We're doing this because it's fun to do. He was doing this and training people to do this for very specific purposes. Yes. You know, there are things we've tried to implement. Like I know some tournaments have allowed pommel strikes with the longsword. It's always bothered me for a couple of reasons. One, people tend to be much more excited and their control tends to suffer. But two, most modern fencing masks are not made to take that kind of punishment. Yes. And given the fact that Fiore had an average for the number of teeth people lost when they got a pommel strike for real, 4, if I remember right, that's a pretty strong blow to get hit with at close quarters. And it could damage equipment or the person. So probably things that we need to modify. Yes. Just as you have to kind of be aware of the change in weapons, like 140-pound draw, I know I couldn't even do that. It's crazy.
And even if you pull it, because we, in our team, we try to just have this heavy bow using,
right.
But and you train and you do it, you develop muscles. First of all, you cannot always do it every day, because even the Persian manuscripts say you need to use kaman and nan, because otherwise you're going to destroy yourself, your joints. So you need to use lighter bow for everyday training, but from, let's say, once a week, whatever, you use this heavy bow. But then the second problem we are having, listen to this, please. If you use at these targets, like this plastic or whatever, which are expensive, what kind of arrow do you want to use to have to withstand this force? And then second, when it goes through the target, getting it out. How do you want to get it out? You see, then another problem comes up: arrow design, and then the target design. What kind of target should I use? You see, there are so many considerations.
There are.
You see, to use these type of things.
Well, and it's true, because how, even their target is going to affect how you analyze the effect of that bow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Those are all important things. My favorite example for fencing is for a variety of reasons, people love to cut tatami mats like you do in some Japanese systems.
Yes.
And, I think, for long sword, a lot of times it's like a 4-inch, diameter. And for sword in 2 hands, that makes sense. But I've seen people try to cut that with saber too. Some sabers will do it just fine. But nobody seems to ask, one, is that an appropriate target for a one-handed weapon? And two, what's the goal with cutting? Is the goal to cut within the parameters of a given system's mechanics, or is it just to cut the tatami? That's all I'll say about that. But the emphasis seems to be, it's more on getting through there cleanly than it is necessarily using the technique advocated in a particular system. That affects our outcomes too. If I am, let's say, the school saber that I study, for example, Radialian saber, we typically use a smaller target. One of the best ones is, bamboo, maybe an inch and a half. That's plenty. It can still check the same things with edge alignment and everything else. Is that what the Italians used? No. So there's that difference too.
Yes, and cutting bamboo is also not easy, as many people think. No, it's really not.
It's hard, and especially if you have like a 600-gram saber with a very thin edge, you have to. If you're not careful, you'll break, dent the weapon. So it's tough stuff. But if I were to use the same thing against 4 inches of tatami, there's no reason for me to do that. I'm not going to learn much from that, except that it's frustrating. And I would say that, all of the examples that we've talked about show that, our interpretations are really only as good as the evidence that we have and our ability to make sense of it.
Yes.
And so any conclusions we take from shooting arrows, well, if they hit a hay bale, that's one thing. If they hit, a cork board, that's another thing. They hit those ballistic dummies, that's another thing. And then there's, of course, trying to dig the arrow out of the wood behind it, depending on how forceful it is. So those are all important considerations. So those are sort of some general points. And then I thought it might be useful to kind of talk about, how does this actually work? Let's say you've got a source and you want to look at it.
Yes.
For me, it comes down to a couple of things. So as an English speaker, and more importantly, as an American, my language ability is not like it is in many other nations. I grew up speaking mostly English, a little bit of Spanish when I was younger. But the languages that I read, I only read. And so that's very limiting. As I like to say, with this, I could tell you what this page says, but I can't order off a menu. I have a very limited vocabulary. It's because I learned, say, French and German for a specific academic discipline at a specific period of time. And so that affects my ability to read it. It also means that by definition, I have to have someone check my work. Lucky for me, I know a lot of native speakers and academically trained native speakers. So, I can do that with some accuracy. So with the text, we have to analyze it. That's hard. That means sort of looking at it, reading it over and over again, and trying to make sense of what they say. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. But interpreting that text is an exercise. It goes beyond just reading it. It means breaking it down, even if it's sentence by sentence. And then there's a separate sort of interpretation. So if, let's say, going back to Fiore, I interpret a situation where you get close in one of the stretto plays and you manipulate someone's elbow, and so that you could break it if you wanted to. Well, now I have to interpret that action for students. So there are a lot of questions that go into that. Do my students know how to grapple safely? Do they have a wrestling background or jiu-jitsu or something that's going to make them understand that they need to be careful? Are they going to just go for it and cripple their friends? So I've interpreted the text, but now I've got to interpret how I'm going to share that text with people depending on their skill, age group, all those things. And then I have to figure out, okay, am I going to teach this one-on-one? Am I going to teach it in a class setting? Because I use slightly different tools to do those things. So in this case, this is a piece I've been working on. And lucky for me, Rob Runekers and Anne Chavot have a new translation out of it, which is very good. I like it a lot because they have an excellent introduction, but also they have the transcribed French and English in the same volume, which is very helpful. So why would I choose this work? It's an important early French work. People later on talk about it. It's possibly a transitional work, meaning here that this is written in 1653. There's some rapier elements, but there's some smallsword elements. And so it could probably work for either, depending on the weight. It's systematic, well organized, and it's geared towards effectiveness, with the caveat that he talks about the difference between fighting for real and fighting in a school. Yes. He's not the first one to do so, but that's another sort of text showing that difference. Yes. It's also interesting culturally. Here's a fencing master in a country which has outlawed dueling multiple times. Yes. So he has to justify his job. Yes. And one of the sort of typical things you'll read is, well, if people kill each other off in the country, then we won't have enough fighting people if a foreign enemy comes after us. George Silver had said the same thing in 1599. It's a common thing. Dueling depletes our manpower reserves. And then oddly enough, and I don't think I put a picture of it, at this time there was a strange duel fought at very close quarters between people armed with a pistol and a knife. Yeah. And Baynard thought this was just insane. I tend to agree with him. You're definitely going to get hurt doing this. And for him, it didn't require any skill. At least if you're going to do this, have some ability. This is just plain murder in his eyes. So it's an interesting text from that point of view. So questions that I take when I look at the text, what is it that I value in it? What popped out to me? Why do I want to work with it? Yeah. And what is different in this text, say, from the one we looked at before with, say, long-term students? Following up on that, what are they going to get out of it? How does it help them? Does it add to their knowledge, their skill set? And there's also a distinction to be made, and I think this is an important one, between what they need to know and what they want to know. So, for example, a lot of texts that include grappling, for some reason, people really love this. And as somebody who teaches, fencing, to me, grappling is something you do when we failed with the sword. That's my take. Alex Spryer would say that the sword is a means to get close enough to grapple somebody. But I think we're both right, just context. But as a teacher, there are certain things that I want them to know that they need to know. before they can move on to something else, even if it's something that they really want to know. And one of the more uncomfortable truths for an instructor, especially for academic ones, is that a lot of the stuff that really intrigues us, most people don't care about. And we have to be okay with that. And that's okay. You know, when I stand back from it, I realize, okay, with the adults that I work with, most are working, they have families. This is for fun. They really don't want to hear me talk about the manuscript relationships between the different recensions of this text. That's fine.
You know, Jim, all of us know that. For example, I don't want to not talk about my books. I mean, I also published 200 print articles. Sometimes I wonder how many people have read these. You know, you know, it is that even books, people buy them to look at artifacts.
They do. I know. I wonder the same thing with things I've written, you know, and once in a while I'll have an idea, but even those are somebody who maybe looked at it, but I don't know if they actually read it. And then I almost never does anyone tell me, hey, I read your article. I want to talk to you about this, or I disagree with this.
You see?
I love that. I would love to know that, you know, the things I put out there are helpful or not helpful.
Yeah.
You know, and I get it. You know, things have changed a lot too. You know, we talked last time about some, like, we look at computers like really cool typewriters.
Yes.
I still go to written sources before I go to anything else. And I assume it never occurs to me that something is long or short. If I want to read it, I just read it, regardless of its length. But I've gotten a lot of complaints from people saying, you know, I'd read that post or I'd read that article, but it's really long. Okay. I mean, if it really interests you, you'll read it. But I think in the age of Twitter, where you've got 140 characters, maybe things have shifted. You know, you need enough attention span to read that.
Yeah.
And you can't learn fencing in 140 characters. Like, you can't learn it from a book, let alone that's something that's short. So you have to spend the time. You have to put in the time. So, you know, as a historian, I have to remember to step back and not bore students with history stuff, because if they want to know, I can tell them, but we usually do it after class or through email or something like that. So what they do need are basics. They need to know, okay, here's this system, and here's what it says about the very basic fundamental things. So the position for guard, you know, going back to that other image, if you would indulge me for a second, here's Baynard's on guard position.
Yes.
And these correspond, some of the geometrical things, to things that he says in the text about your positioning.
Yeah.
Going back to here, there's some basic movement, basic attacks, basic defenses. And to be quite frank, I think we should spend a lot more time on these than we do all the other things. So what do they need to know? I used this example because I was working with Lange's text. And this is where, I mean, I like my version of this just because it shows you, okay, here's the text, and there's me trying to sort of do the same thing, but I'm not doing it quite the same way, right? You see my interpretation, but my other arm is in a different position. It gets kind of the idea of what's happening, but it's not one-to-one. And so in terms of sharing a basic stance with somebody, why would I have my, you know, offhand in this position? Well, at the time, a lot of times the hand was used to knock the sword away or to parry and then check it and keep going. So for me, this is just more comfortable to do that. Some texts will have it here, some texts have it up high. So, you know, this is a basic position, but you already see I've changed it a little bit in this particular instance. Other things to consider: accuracy. So this is a picture from Rossi, and it's a great little diagram showing a couple of different ways to make the Molinelli, or the elbow-driven cuts. Depend on the source, right? So my tradition for sabre, one of the things that's sort of a hallmark of the Riedelian system is the use of the elbow as the axis of rotation. And there are very important reasons for that. We've discussed this before, but
yeah.
Radielli was a cavalryman. He wanted to make the cavalry more effective. And the system that he taught we have books that teach mostly unmounted drill. And so these are troopers learning to make those big cuts for the saddle on foot. There's also my take on this source. And in this case, that means, okay, here's how you make the Molinelli according to these masters. Here's how you can use them. And that's a different thing. Other considerations, these are powerful cuts, so safety is important, right? If I'm using a period weight weapon, that's going to pack a little bit more punch than an Olympic saber. And introducing how to use these can take some time. So the Molinelli served as an exercise, sort of, and they actually say to get the arm strong enough, to get the edge correctly aligned. They're also useful for offense. You can use them that way. You can also use them defensively, kind of like an intercepting parry as it is.
Yes.
But I don't introduce all that at once. So when I teach a student, the basic thing is just making the motion. So a lot of times that's part of our warm-up. We'll just go through the 6 Molinelli, or maybe 3, just to get the arm practiced and warm. But it's not wasted because they're working on the mechanics, they're working on different aspects of it. We may do that static at first, and then we may add it with a lunge. If they're more advanced, we'll add the scarto, which is this sort of leaning into the cut and back into the parry. Those are refinements on a basic idea. And then when I teach it tactically, which I'll be doing in April down in Texas, that's in a lot of ways my interpretation of what I've read. So there are synoptic tables full of lesson ideas, which is one of the reasons I love this system. But one of the criticisms that Radialian saber has gotten is that the arm is so exposed. Well, that's true, depending on what you're doing. If I'm on guard and I just start here from distance, I'm exposing my arm. So how do I not do that? Well, I use a preparatory action, right? So a classic example would be to thrust, and then when they go to parry, come over the top. And there are different ways that you could use that. You could go straight to the head, straight to the chest, cut to the arm first. You could cut to the arm and then thrust with opposition for a double strike. Yeah. There are different ways to do that. But a brand new student is really just going to work on the basic stuff. And as excited as I might be to share it all with them, because that's the fun part, I have to pace it. When they're ready, then you move them up. And some things are just difficult by definition. I love these images because they're almost comic, I think, to a modern audience. Viardita's guy there, it looks like he's about to split his pants. This is the Neapolitan enervated lunge. It's a straight-legged lunge. And I really struggled with this when I first started reading the text. Now I think I know what it is, tentatively. Doesn't mean I do it well. I am not 20, so landing that hard on my front foot, not a lot of fun. But there were important things that I didn't consider when I was reading this. I kind of forgot what I'd read before. And so one of the things that Patrick Bratton pointed out to me is like, well, you only do this lunge when you're using rapier and dagger. Oh, that's right. And of course, when I reread it, I popped right out. But it's basically the idea that because your guard position changes, so if I'm more squared, it's sort of a quick pop out this way than it is the longer lunge that you use with the sword alone. Yeah. And it's difficult to do. It's a lot shorter. It's quick. But it's strange compared to the sort of quote unquote normal lunge that most people learn. And I put that in here just because it's one of these things where, when you look at the text, it's like, what am I supposed to do with this? And if you only go by the pictures, you might make a lot of assumptions that you shouldn't make. You really have to read the text.
Sure.
Yeah. And then from page to practice, what does that mean? How do you put these things into your system, into your teaching? These are 3 different, with Angelo in the middle there, 3 different pictures of teaching. Most of these were individual lessons or classes. The one at the bottom was just this past weekend where my friend Alex came and taught the smallsword system of Zachary Wilde from 1712. It's a really basic completely self-defense oriented approach to smallsword. It gets a lot of, I think a lot of more highly trained fencers tend to kind of look down their noses at it because it's not quite as pretty, but it's effective, and it was designed to keep you alive. I actually think it's pretty fun, and I don't focus on that. I focus on some other text, but the students that were working with Alex, they're at a point where they're ready to look at other sources. And so, part of my approach with teaching smallsword is that we have a lot of different ways people did this. At a certain point, you probably should know some of those, at least a little bit. If for no other reason, then you may face somebody using it. Yes. And now you know a little bit more about how to fight it. But everything is interpretation. And so even when I'm going from a page, in this case, if you look at the image of from Angela, where the person's parrying forth through an inside parry, the picture at sunset there, the person in the background is making that same parry. And this is an interpretation of that text. There are a lot of things that go into how I look at that text and get people to do it. But that's sort of the basic plan is, here's the text. We want to do that.
Yes.
So some basic guidelines that I give my students and that I try to go with, and again, this is not exhaustive, this is introductory. Read, 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 read again, and then read again. A lot of times the texts that we're reading are assuming a different convention in terms of reading comprehension, in terms of audience. And so it's not enough to just read the text once and think, okay, yeah, I got it. Read it again, read it slowly. Read it out loud. Maybe write parts of it down. Make sure that you have an understanding of what they're saying, because that's vital to get to what it means.
Yes.
I'm a big believer in relying on previous research. You're an academic, nobody reinvents the wheel. We all step on the shoulders of giants.
Yes.
It's important. You don't have to do all that work when somebody has done some of it. And the problem with historical fencing is that a lot of times we've got some very good work out there and we have some not so very good work.
Yes.
Distinguishing between those is difficult.
Yes.
How do you make that assessment? And here's the hard part. There are certain things that should help. What is their professional training? What's their academic training?
Yes.
That's usually a guide, but then we also have people who weren't academically trained that bring something else to the table, who are just very good at this.
Yes.
And I think we need to be open to anybody's expertise, as long as they can establish that and demonstrate it well, regardless of certification. And that's a hard thing to puzzle out sometimes.
Yes.
But a couple things that tend to stick out to me: better scholars and researchers, whatever their training, tend to be open to correction. They tend to be open to input. It's the people who kind of, solidify a position and stick to it that tends to be more of a red flag for me. If I had an interpretation 10 years ago, likely if I've been studying and I've been continuing my work, it's a little different than it was 10 years ago. That's not always the case, but I know for a fact that I've learned a lot more about the sabre system that I teach just from working with other people, just from teaching it, just from reading new texts, reading texts I've already read. And you have to be open to that and let yourself be wrong. That's important. And I tend to say, if you run into somebody who thinks they've got it all figured out, they don't. They may think so, but they don't. And we get a lot of sort of, how to put this, characters who are convinced of their own genius. That's a dangerous place to be. Always be open to correction. As I said before, consider what students need, and apart from what they want to do. So, if you're teaching Fiore, start with the basic stuff. Don't put them in armor and have them use poleaxes. That's hard. You need a lot of control, a lot of armor, and unbelievable amounts of restraint. Because even with like a rubber axe head, you're going to ring somebody's bell. And that's important. Baby steps. And I think we too often in this community, people are pushed to do too much. And really, we should just be spending more time on fundamentals. I'm not the only one that said this, but, in most high-level fights of whatever martial art you're talking about, it's usually simpler actions done at extremely precise, perfect moments, well executed, than it is anything fancy. And I may have told this story before, but when one of the masters I worked with, we did this very complicated drill. And after the lesson, I asked him, I said, Maestro, when would I use this? And he laughed. He said, oh, you'll never use this. This is an exercise. We do this complicated thing because it makes the one simple thing easier. Okay, that makes sense. Use the tools that help most. And this, unfortunately, may be a little controversial, but I'm a big believer in working from the universal principles that underline fencing. Maestro Handelman talks about those as the elements of fencing. Whatever term you want to use, there are things that are kind of common to most hand-to-hand fighting with these weapons. If you're not working from those, things can go wrong really fast. Also, I'm a big believer that if there is some modern system, hopefully in some kind of relationship to the past, you could use that to work backwards. So in my case, I work on small sword and rapier a lot. Well, foil and epee today, in various complicated ways, derive from those weapons. So if you understand the modern game and its exceptions, you can use that as a basis to look at things. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be one-to-one. The conventions of modern foil, for example, if you only look at the similarities, you're going to miss the important differences. So you can't just take it at faith. You have to look at it and think, okay, how is my parry 4 in foil today? How does that help me understand parry 4 200 years ago? And you have to be tentative, but it's a good way to do that. The other thing that's valuable about that is that it gives you a vocabulary with which to approach those manuscripts and to understand them. So we still use the word riposte, to parry and then hit back. So we use that, a secondary attack. A lot of the terms are still the same, even if they've changed meaning over time. Again, your semantic shift. There are dictionaries for this. There are fencing dictionaries for this. There are people who've spent decades studying that can tell you, oh, okay, well, this word changes. It used to mean this. It means this. And in some cases, like the Italian system is so old that certain words will be different regionally. So I would think of, transports, for example. So if I take the blade from one line to another, one school calls that legamenti, another one calls it transporti, right? They're the same thing, unless you're the school that uses transporti, then you may be using legamenti differently. So little distinctions like that. But that vocabulary is going to help you unpack, as it were, the past much more easily than just making it up. Now, on that note, I've been asked, okay, well, what are those universals? Now, this is just one list. It's a pretty good one. So distance or measure, the distance between two opponents. It varies. In my system, most of the stuff that we look at is either out of distance, where you can't hit one another, in distance, where you can, and then close distance, where you can just reach out and hit each other at will. Tempo. We normally define that as a unit of fencing time, which is each action equals one tempo. So if I extend my arm, that's a tempo. If I step, that's a tempo. And different masters can define this or expand upon it in different ways. But it remains a key element of what we do. Judgment. That is to say, knowing when to do what action or respond in this way or set up this attack. That's very hard to do. Speed. Speed is how quickly or slowly one makes an action. It's sometimes confused with tempo, but they're technically different. So, for example, I can make a slow extension, but I can make a fast extension. They're both extensions, but I'm doing them at different speeds, for different tactical reasons. Initiative, in the most basic sense, just means who starts an action. You have two people who are going back and forth. Who starts the attack? That's going to set in play a bunch of other reactions, theoretically. Maybe they just hit the person. Maybe the person blocks. Everything comes out of that. And then tradecraft does not get enough attention. And I know it's going to make some people very unhappy, but tradecraft is everything. I define that as not just understanding competitive rule sets or how officials work, but the psychology of fighting, how you intimidate an opponent, how you read an opponent, all of those things. For some examples, there are a lot of different rule sets for HEMA and historical fencing in general. Not all of them are great. And a lot of times they'll apply one rule set to a weapon to another weapon where it doesn't really work. That's part of the game. If you're a competitive fighter, you have to understand the rules because rules can be gamed.
Yes.
Can be influenced. Officials can be affected.
Yes.
Sometimes you're dealing with something that's incompetent. Sometimes you're dealing with corruption. To name one example, I was in an épée tournament long time ago.
Yes.
And the director, who was actually worked for a rival school of mine, was giving advice to my opponent in Spanish. I understand Spanish, so I don't speak it very well. I still speak like a 6-year-old, but I knew what he was saying, and so I just countered everything. And finally, he looked over at me. He said, "Do you speak Spanish?" I said, "I understand it." And he's like, "Oh," and his face went red because he was trying to help my opponent. If I didn't understand, this guy would have had my number, right? Never mind the way that we used to have 4 judges in sabre, and you could abstain. So somebody might see your shot and just kind of go, "Oh, I didn't see it." All kinds of crazy things that people do in competition.
To be honest with you, that's why, Jim,
yeah.
I think maybe last time, no, it was not last time, but just one of the interviews we had.
Yeah.
I have lost all my interests in any sort of competition. Be it with weapons, unarmed. I'm not saying, look, many of my guys want to fight in martial arts like sambo, judo, jiu-jitsu, MMA, fencing, armored fighting. But I personally, I tell you what, there are 2 reasons. One is, again, tampering with all these rules. The second, all these egos. I can't, and Jim, I decided, I train with my students. They can go and fight. I understand they're young. For example, we can train with each other. We can spar with each other or not spar, doesn't matter. We can do solo combinations. We can get in a very good shape. I cannot see these atmosphere anymore because I tell you what, we have enough of these type of toxic atmosphere in companies now. Do I want to have it in my free time in the shape of so-called competitions? No, thank you. I see it in the corporate world. Do I need it?
No. Well, and this is, it's a great pity too, because, when I was competing for a long time, I really enjoyed it. I look forward to it.
Yes.
Even with the issues that were in play. And this was, pre-electric sabre, for example. We had all kinds of problems, but it was still fun. Most teams were rather friendly. In fact, for a long time before electric, there were certain schools that, because our bouts, our pools were faster than everybody else's, we just keep fencing just for fun. And it was a great opportunity. I went to school in Southern California, and there were a ton of other colleges that had fencing programs. So we'd finish early. We'd just start fencing with other people from other schools. 2 weeks later, we might be fighting them again in a competition. But the camaraderie that built, the respect that built, was really big. And it made that a much more, for a time anyway, a healthier environment. And for the same reasons, I don't compete much anymore either. I'll do some friendly bouting, when I go to different venues. I try to fence the people that are there just because it's fun, and I get to fence with new people. That's always fun. But in terms of like trying to get a ranking or trophies, or
That's what
first
I
of all,
meant. Exactly. And not competition or sparring per
yeah,
se. No, no, no.
yeah,
Quest, or
yeah,
this
yeah,
desire to have these rankings, trophies. That's what I meant. Yes.
yeah. And it's, if people want to do that, great.
Yes.
A
Yes.
lot of the people that I work with, like with Storica Defensa, we have a competitive side to the pedagogical side, and that's by
Yes.
design, because a lot of people want to compete, and that's fine. Competing is good for people. It can be a
Yes.
lot of fun. It can be done better.
Yes.
But for me, I spent a long time, and I've reached an age where,
Yes.
first of all, the amount of training I have to put in, I don't have time to do. I am very busy. I have kids, I have work,
Yes.
and I have injuries from previous competitions that I need to take care of. So, I've aged out in a way. But the other side of it, and I think the side that really gets me, is just how ugly that culture
Yes.
has become. I really, I lament the fact that that's the case, and historical fencing, and martial arts in general, there's such a wide variety of personalities and approaches to this stuff.
Yes.
I've seen some really crazy things. One of my favorites is, there's a popular YouTube guy that does training videos and puts a lot of his own fights up. And maybe it's in good faith, I don't know, but he'll say things that are obvious and already well established, but it sounds like he's invented them. You know, I don't I don't know him, so I hesitate to give much reason for that. But the way it reads to me is, well, I already know what horizontal and vertical mean. You don't need to describe those to me. The lunge has been around a long time. It doesn't sound like you really invented that. Uh, just my take. Now, I may be misreading that. There are other people who talk a good game, but you never see them fight.
Yeah.
Or there are people who fight all the time, but don't want footage of them losing to be out there.
Yeah.
As if somebody always wins. I mean, there are some rare cases in history of people who really, for some reason, like Saint-Georges, for example, in France, the guy did really well. Most people, we win some, we lose some. And
Yeah, of course.
shouldn't be surprised. For me, as an instructor, there's footage of me getting my butt kicked. I think that's important because I'm not perfect. I lose. I get hit, and I think students need to see that, because it's what we do about that. Okay, so I'm failing against this attack. Well, that means I need to work harder at it. That means I need to figure out how it works. And then once I get that figured out, there'll be something else I have to work on.
Yes.
It's just healthy.
Yes.
I don't have a sufficient ego to worry about my image in terms of that. I'm a teacher, and as a fencing instructor, I'm sorry, but your job is mostly being a target. We wear a plastron for a reason. People are hitting us constantly.
Yes.
And so it also affects the way we fight. I teach more than I fight now. And so even when I get on the strip to fight or in the ring, half the time I have to remember, wait, this isn't a teaching bout. Because I'll do crazy things, like I'll leave an opening. I'm like, why am I doing that? Because I'm not teaching right now. So things change. We change with the game as we get older.
Yes.
And I value competition. I think it's helpful. I think when it's done well, it's great. The problem is I just see it done so poorly so often. And worse, I see a lot of younger, less experienced fighters going in and taking meaning from tournament ratings and trophies and medals that aren't necessarily what they think they are. And we've talked about this before, but if I go to a tournament of 5 people and I win, I may come away thinking, oh, I'm the best. When I go to a tournament of 50 or 100, I may not do as well. And if I'm not aware of that, I may take that really hard and very personally.
Yes, that's right.
And as I tell my students, again, I think we've talked about this. Number one, just assume everyone you fence is going to be the toughest opponent you've ever had.
Yes,
because it
absolutely.
you win. And two, realize you are not always going to win. There is always somebody better than you are. And if you're lucky, you get to fight them and learn. And so, I think those kinds of approaches don't work with modern competition. That's not what it's about.
No.
And that's fine. For the people that love that, have at it. But for me, I'm not as interested in that. And I won't tell my students not to compete, but I do try to prep them. I'm like, okay, so if you want to do this, this is what you're getting into. And there are ways to get around that. I have friends who do it all the time. In fact, a good friend of mine in Canada was at a tournament that the guys actually told them they came up with rules to try to disadvantage him. He won anyway because he's good. But that kind of thing happens. That was a personal attack on him.
Yes.
That shouldn't happen, but it does. Yeah. And I think, the other thing to think about with fencing, especially historical fencing translations and books,
yes,
they're not all equal. There are a lot of collections of sources, for example, but no analysis about those sources.
That's true.
They're useful to a point,
yes.
But you've got to do all the hard work. Some translations are better made than others. Some analysis of those translations is better than others.
Yes.
And so it pays to do your homework.
Yes.
And there are people in the community that will help you. I've been really lucky, I think. Whenever I've approached one of the translators, they've been patient, kind. Just recently with Charbonnet, I sent Rob Runnekers a message saying, hey, I think I don't understand what's happening in this passage. And I was just overthinking it. He not only explained it to me, but he sent me a video of his team at Renaissance Sword Club doing it. And I was like, oh, okay. That's simple. I should have known that. But I think people like when they know you've read their work. We were just talking about it. It'd be great if somebody was like, hey, Dr. Corsani, I read your book on archery. This was fantastic. You'd be thrilled. And so I think don't be afraid to reach out to the people who do this. And in some cases, years ago, I reached out to Chris Holzman for some help with Italian sabre.
Yes.
He's one of the people I talk to every week now, and I've got to know him a little bit. We haven't met in person yet, but I've talked for years.
Yes.
And to this day, if I have a question, he's really quick to help me out, and he's unbelievably generous about it. So, I feel very fortunate to have sort of found a community within the community that's helpful. And on that note, I should say, the other big problem that we have in terms of interpretation, we tend to get into these sort of pods, echo chambers, and nothing's more dangerous. So as much as I may not agree with another group's interpretation, I still try to figure out why they came up with it and how they understand it, because I can make the same mistake.
Yes.
I want to get the most accurate interpretation I can, given the evidence and reason. And that means being open to other interpretations. And so I understand it. Somebody will lock down a position, yes, and they'll fortify and they'll stay there.
Yes.
It doesn't tend to go well. They tend to get very bent out of shape when somebody dares question them. And that seems very silly to me in a community with as tentative a grasp of information as we have.
Yes.
I think we need to be a little bit more humble about it than that.
Okay. Very good input, Jim.
Well, thank you for having me back on. I mean, I love talking about this stuff, and it's fun to talk with you because I know you deal with the same issues within your field, and
yes,
we're all in it together. And if it helps more people out, great.
Absolutely. Jim, are you now done with your slides?
Yeah, that was all I had. Just kind of a quick presentation, so I can turn that off if you want.
Yes, please.
Okay,
perfect.
There we go.
So I'm going to put it on the channel, on our channel. So then you also said, I'm going also to put your website, the link to your website, because if people, you said, want to have access to some information, they can come directly to your website, so they can be redirected.
Thank you for doing that. That's a great idea. I should
Sure.
say for anyone watching, I don't normally use slides with as much verbiage, but since we're doing it online and it might help to have transcription,
Yes.
I'll make a copy of this available for people, and
Yes.
I'll put a link on the page in case they want it. I've done
Absolutely.
that in the past, and I usually have like a PDF and a transcription.
Yes.
That way, if it's useful to them, they can use it.
Yes.
Again, I don't
PDF
know
is
if
the
anyone.
best.
Okay, we'll
Absolutely.
do. Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jim, do you want
Lots
to
of fun.
add anything?
No, just thanks for having me on. I hope we can do more of these. I think it's
Sure.
good for us to have a chance to compare notes and
Jim,
talk about
I
it.
would really like, I mean, of course, I know you are very busy. I would really like that if you wish, we could go to and concentrate on one manuscript and talk
Absolutely.
about that.
Sure.
Right. And then we can go to
I love
another manuscript. Do you have
Sure.
time or would you love to do that? I
Oh,
think
yeah.
this
No,
would
I'd love to
be,
do that. I mean, I do a lot of that anyway. I think what might help best, and tell me what you think, but we could have, we could do a little bit sort of a shorter version of something like this with the source and maybe an action or two, and then I'll bring one of my friends or students over, and we can
yes,
kind of go through it and show like, okay, well, here's the page, here's the thing, here's us trying to do it.
yes, yes. Perfect.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to do that. Absolutely.
Perfect. Yes,
Yeah.
we can do this one.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And I
Thank you.
wish you a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And good night. See you.
Bye-bye.